Hi there, I'm Father Isaac, and welcome to the second episode of Brother from Another Father on this 19th Sunday in Ordinary Time. In today's first reading, we see the prophet Elijah suffering from classical burnout syndrome. He is sitting forlornly under a broom tree in the desert and praying to the Lord that the Lord takes his life with these words, "This is enough. I've had enough, Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." We might have the same experience and know what it is to give and keep on giving and get no recognition or thanks from anyone, and instead only be met by failure. This is certainly Elijah's experience. And maybe our hearts go out to him and we feel sympathy for him. But we should not, because Elijah only has himself to blame for this burnout syndrome, as a close study of the text that we will now embark on will reveal. In order to do so, we need to go back to the beginning of Elijah's story in chapter 17 of the first book of Kings, where we see Elijah embarking on a plan to bring the people of Israel back to covenantal fidelity with the Lord, because they have lost themselves in idolatry. And so Elijah prophesies that there will be a drought. But this drought so angers the king of Israel, Ahab, that Elijah is forced to flee for his life. He has to go to the little town of Zarephath, where he encounters a widow who provides for him and gives him shelter, and provides for him with flour and oil, making cakes and bread for him, even though she only has but a handful left every day. The oil and flour miraculously, by the grace of God, replenish themselves. Now, I said that we should not have any sympathy for Elijah. Elijah's story plays out like the typical story of any classical Old Testament prophet, as one who announces a message from God and then gets rejected and persecuted. But this is not actually the case. For when a prophet receives the word of the Lord, often the author in the Old Testament books will say, "The word of the Lord came to the prophet X, say to the people of Israel," and then the prophecy follows on. But in this first book of Kings, chapter 17, verse 1, we are not told that the word of the Lord comes to the prophet Elijah, say to the people of Israel, this. Instead, I think the author wants us to conclude, since this preface is absent, that this was Elijah's own harebrained scheme to wean the people off from their idolatry, and that it was not at all God's plan. And this intuition is further confirmed when we study the actual words of Elijah's prophecy. He says, "By the Lord Adonai, the God of Israel, as I live, there will be neither dew nor rain on the earth for many years unless I give the word." Unless I give the word, meaning Elijah? Surely if this was the Lord's plan, it should be unless the Lord gives the word, unless the Lord sees that you have returned to fidelity of the covenant with God. And so we see that Elijah is setting his own agenda and expecting God to fall into lockstep. And perhaps we are more like Elijah than we care to admit. We often have a plan, especially when we think that we're serving God or serving truth or justice or righteousness, and we want to attack, all guns blazing, the problem head on. And we don't even bother to check with God if this is actually God's plan. We don't bother to discern. And then the plan backfires, and we then go and complain to God because God has not come to our rescue. Happily for Elijah, God is very merciful, and God comes to Elijah's rescue and provides for him through this widow whose flour and oil never run out. But God wants to put Elijah back on the straight and narrow, and he says to Elijah, "Go now and tell King Ahab that the drought is over, that the rain will come." Does Elijah do this? No, not at all. What do we read in the text? That Elijah goes to Ahab, and instead of prophesying that the drought is over, he sets up this huge competition, this kind of game of fireworks now, with the priests of Baal, the 400 priests of Baal, who he assembles on this mountain and gets them to put a sacrifice on a pile of wood, and he puts a sacrifice on a pile of wood, and then says, "Whosever God responds with fire, that is the true God." And so instead of prophesying the coming of water, what does Elijah do? He prophesies the coming of fire, the exact opposite of what God told him to do. And this plan too backfires. For some curious reason, God decides to go along with this strategy of Elijah's and lights the sacrifice of Elijah, at which point Elijah gives instructions for the 400 priests of Baal to be all put to death. Does this convert the people of Israel? No, not at all. What does it do? It causes Queen Jezebel, Ahab's wife, to become livid with anger and to start baying for Elijah's blood. And so once again, Elijah is forced to flee for his life. And this is where we pick up the story in today's first reading and find Elijah having fled the nation of Israel in the desert, forlorn, and just completely sapped of energy, burnt out. And he says to the Lord, Lord, I give up. I've tried everything. I've served you, but nothing's working. You may as well take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. And here Elijah is like a typical teenager, just throwing all his toys out the cot because his plan didn't work. He set his own agenda, didn't listen to God, didn't follow God's plans. Things didn't go according to plan. They completely backfired at him. And now he's saying, oh, I give up. He's in a typical adolescent sulk. And perhaps we do the same. Perhaps we throw our toys out the cot when we come at a problem head on, all guns blazing, and expect the problem to be just flattened by God's grace and our own efforts. Well, God doesn't play our games. God doesn't dance to our tune. We need to learn to dance to God's tune. And this is what God wants to teach the prophet Elijah. And so with incredible compassion and incredible mercy and a delicate touch on Elijah's shoulders, God sends the angel to wake up Elijah and say, eat, for this journey is long. What is this journey? It's the journey to Mount Horeb. It's the journey out of spiritual adolescence to spiritual maturity, where Elijah must learn the all-important lesson that God is not to be found in the big, spectacular events, in the hurricane, in the fire, or in the earthquake. Rather, God is to be found in the still, quiet, gentle voice of a breeze. That is where God's voice is to be discerned. And Elijah must learn to listen to this voice, must learn to quiet down his life enough so that he has space and silence enough to hear this voice of God, and must learn the all-important lesson that sometimes God's action in our lives, in the ordinariness of our lives, where God slips in like a gentle rain shower, is much more effective than our own spectacular fireworks and efforts. And that often choosing not to confront a problem head on, but to allow God's grace to quietly seep into our lives and seep into a situation, and to delicately discern that action of God is far more effective and saves us from being burnt out and preserves our energy that we may continue to praise and live and love God and serve God another day. Have a blessed Sunday.